Hi everyone, it's Paul Brown here from Wealth21. We're approaching the end of 2020, very unusual year, so I've put together an update on the global markets. First of all, importantly, the information in this presentation is just general information only. It doesn't relate to your specific needs or situation. So if you have any questions relating to your specific circumstances, please contact us. I guess there's been some recent developments in the last few months. In November, the Reserve Bank cut the Australian cash rate back to 0.1% from 0.25, which they'd cut to earlier in the year. We had the US election in early November. We have a new president, President-elect Biden. In recent weeks, we've also had some positive news on vaccines, and in fact, the vaccine program has started to be delivered in the UK, and just today I heard that the US had approved the Pfizer vaccine. So we've had positive news there. There's China trade tensions. There's stronger than expected recovery in the global markets, which we'll look at in a moment. Firstly, though, let's have a look at the situation with the COVID pandemic. So this chart here is the cumulative cases per million for a range of different countries. So at the top of the list there is Belgium, actually, which they've got 50,000 cases per 100. So that actually means that 5% of the population in Belgium has tested positive for COVID-19. Second on this chart is the United States, which at this stage has 46,000, so 4.6% of the population have tested positive. The UK is at about 26,000 per million, and Australia, right down the bottom, we only have a bit over 1,000, nearly 1,100 cases per million people. So Australia's done relatively well, very well compared to some of the other nations on this chart. The next chart is the cumulative confirmed deaths, and at the top of the list there is the United States that as of this point in time have had 289,000 deaths across the United States. The UK is at 62,600 and Australia is at 908. And of course, sadly, many of those cases were in Victoria, where they had that outbreak, July through to September. Turning now to the economy, the Australian unemployment rate is currently sitting at about 7%. It was a little higher a couple of months ago, about 7.5%. The unemployment rate may rise a little bit over the coming months, but the forecast for it is to settle, around between 6 and 7% in the next 12 months. This chart is the Australian GDP growth rate. I mean, we had two negative quarters, a slight negative in the first quarter of 2020, a very large negative, about negative 7% in the second quarter. And then in the third quarter, the economy bounced back to a positive growth of about 3.3% in the third quarter. And the forecast is for that growth rate to settle over the next few quarters between 1 and 2%. Turning now to the US. The US had a very significant spike in unemployment earlier in 2020 and then reduced back down to current levels of about 6.7%, I think it is, and the forecast is for it to remain around those levels. Looking at the GDP, US GDP rate, they had a very large negative. I think that was negative 30% in the second quarter of 2020, and then a very large positive in the third quarter. And again, the GDP growth rate in the US is expected to settle around about 2% over the next few quarters. Turning now to the markets, this is the ASX 200. So we had that very significant correction from February, at the end of February to the end of March, and then we had a recovery like through to June, and then it kind of went flat for a couple of months, a few months, and then at the start of November we've had this second run up in the Australian market that started in November. Looking at a sector that has actually done quite well in 2020, and that's the technology sector. It did correct, as did everything else back in February, March, but then you can see that it's had quite a strong run up through the remainder of 2020 during the pandemic. A sector that has fared very poorly, though, has been the listed property market. So this is shopping centres, commercial office buildings and so on. So a very significant correction when the pandemic started. And it's made some sort of recovery. It's had a bit of a bounce in November, but it's still nowhere near where it was prior to the pandemic. And this chart here is the volatility. So the volatility in the Australian share market did spike very significantly in March, April, up above the 50% level, which is very high by historical standards. But as you can see, volatility has now drifted back down towards 15%, which is about in line with normal volatility levels. And finally on Australia, just look at the Australian yield curve. It's looking pretty normal now at the longer end. At the shorter end, the yields, it's got the 6 month. It's reduced over the past 6 months because the Reserve Bank has decreased the interest rate from 0.25 to 0.1%. Finally, on the US, they've had these two recovery legs, I guess if you call that. So following the correction, they had an immediate recovery, and then at the start of November, they've had that bounce up. And the US market is actually quite a bit higher than it was before the pandemic started. So, of course, if there's any questions that you have on any of the details in here, please feel free to give us a call. Okay, so from all of the team at Wealth21, 2020 has been a very unusual year, but we would like to wish you all a safe and happy Christmas and a prosperous 2021.
Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas, everyone.